member of the Green Team. So if you guys don't know who or what Green Team do, we are a group of students that's funded by school to help promote sustainable practice on campus. And we also make different events throughout quarter like this one to have students connected and engaged and also learn more about environmental issues. So if you guys want to know more about us or our upcoming event, you guys can check out the Green Team website by just go to Admin College website and just search up the Green Team and our page will pop up there. And so before we start the presentation, there's a few things I'd like to mention. So first, please be aware that this presentation is being recorded and it will be posted on our Green Team website. And please make sure to use the gallery view so that you can focus on our speaker and also all participant microphone and camera being muted. So if you have any question, any question that you want to ask the speaker, it will be answered at the end after Dr. Jennifer finished her presentation. So for asking questions, you have two options. So the first one, you could use the chat box to write your question over there, and then we will ask the question to Dr. Jennifer, or you can ask her directly by using the reaction sticker, which is on below of your screen on the menu bar, and then you can use the clap hand or sticker, and then we will let you know when you can unmute yourself to ask questions. So since we cannot really unmute you, so we will call out your name when it is your turn to ask the question. So yeah, I think that's it. And then I'll let one of my colleagues, Sarah, to introduce our amazing speaker today.
Hi guys, my name is Sarah. So today we have a really special guest. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Atkinson. She's a professor at UW-Bothell and she teaches environmental humanities. She's also a speaker and an author. A really fun fact about her is that one of her seminars, Climate Grief and Eco-Anxiety, was one of the first college courses of its kind in the US. And it was featured on many popular news articles like Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, NBC News, Seattle Times, and like a lot more. So today her presentation will be on climate grief and eco-anxiety. So I will hand it over to Dr. Atkinson. Hope you guys enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk. My presentation is going to be about like 25 minutes or so. And I'm sorry, I have two screens going. So to look at my notes, I'm going to be looking to the side and not always making eye contact with all of you. But what I would recommend that you do is if you put it on the setting, I think it's the small, Sarah, is it small active viewer so that you can see the screen? Because I'm going to share, I'll do it right now, share my PowerPoints. And then I would just recommend that you basically make the PowerPoint presentation your full screen, and I can just be a little icon over on the side. Let's see. Is everybody able to see that? And you can make me small over on the corner. Is that working, Sarah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And I know that sometimes people have to log off before the end of a talk, so I wanted to list these resources right up front if you do have to leave before we come to the end. The podcast I'm going to be talking about is Facing It, and it explores environmental grief and eco-anxiety. I also have my website up here, which has a lot of different videos and recommended readings and resources if you want to learn more about this topic. And you can also follow me on Instagram if you're interested. I usually post upcoming talks and other events around climate change in our area on that account. So it's a good way to kind of keep updated. I also want to note, just as we get started, that a lot of our climate anxiety from the past couple of years is currently being eclipsed by the COVID-19 pandemic and the stresses and fears around that. But I think that there are really some really instructive overlaps between these two crises, which maybe we could come back to in the Q&A. I'll just say that for now, that some of the strategies that I'm going to be sharing regarding climate chaos are directly applicable to the immediate stressors of our pandemic. So I encourage you to think about some of those connections. Okay, so I think if you logged in today, you already know that our climate situation is really bad. You probably heard the news back in February that Antarctica hit the highest temperature ever recorded. It was 65 degrees in Antarctica. Ocean acidification is getting worse every year. There was a recent UN report saying that 1 million species may be pushed to extinction in coming decades. And just since 1970, populations of vertebrate wildlife have declined by 60% on average worldwide. That's 60%. Arctic ice the Arctic Ocean is projected to become essentially ice-free during the summers by 2050. And then extreme weather events, this is something we're seeing in live time, more frequent and more disastrous weather events like floods and mega fires and hurricanes that we can expect in the coming years. And then remember, like before COVID-19, the biggest international news story was the fires in Australia. And before that, the Amazon was burning. So, all of this attention to the physical impacts is incredibly important, but exclusively focusing on external damage overlooks this landscape of damage that we're all carrying inside of us. Living through an age that is defined by so much destruction of life is just bound to mark us by invisible traumas. And this is the question that I've really been wrestling with in recent years. What kind of emotional and psychological toll are we experiencing from absorbing this relentless and really heartbreaking loss every day when we tune into the news or experience in our everyday lives? But one of the problems is we don't live in a culture that openly mourns those kinds of losses. And that makes it really hard to fully process their personal impact or even recognize that they exist, because most of us don't even have a language to talk about it. That is starting to change in recent years. More terms like eco-anxiety, climate grief, climate despair, those are creeping into our vocabulary. And it's not just climate activists that are using this language. The American Psychological Association put out a major report in 2017 documenting this as a mental health crisis. Climate psychology has become a new field as therapists are seeing more patients with eco-anxiety and depression. So I'm going to give examples of 4 different groups that typically are experiencing climate grief, and then a few insights that we might get from each of them. The first group are students and young people, and that's the group that I know the best. It's actually the reason that I got interested in this topic. I've taught at the University of Washington for the past 11 years, and every year I see more and more despair among undergraduates. On this slide here, these are quotes from the first day of a class that I taught a couple months ago. Students are saying that they don't want to have kids when they grow up because they could live in an apocalyptic future. Some are having trouble sleeping at night because their minds are playing out scenarios of water wars and climate refugees and mass extinction. And they feel a lot of anger towards the previous generation that handed them this mess, in addition to a very deep sense of betrayal because that generation before them knew about the science but did not act. So researchers like Stephen Running have mapped these responses onto the 5 classic stages of grief. And there are actually a ton of different models out there. Some of them have 12 stages. They're also not exactly linear. You might skip around in terms of what stage you're in at any given moment. And I'm sure though everybody who's engaged with these issues has had some experience, whether they're in a state of denial or anger or depression. Then the second group I would highlight are scientists. Environmental scientists suffer some of the highest rates of eco-depression and despair, which is not surprising since they're documenting the disappearance of our natural world up close. So if coral reefs or rainforests or a particular species, if that's your life's work, watching it die can be incredibly traumatizing. Catherine Wilkinson is one of the senior writers of the book Drawdown, and she once said, quote, "There is no way for me not to have a broken heart most days." Then the third category of impacted groups are all of the communities on the front lines who are directly harmed, right? This is not just something they're reading about in the news. There is an extensive body of research now, including a major study from the APA linking climate disruption to chronic anxiety and depression, to post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, suicide and suicidal thoughts, sleep disorders, and a lot more. And not surprisingly, poor and marginalized communities and communities of color are suffering the heaviest impacts and therefore the most dramatic emotional toll from climate assaults. These are communities that already have inadequate access to affordable shelter and healthcare or reliable emergency services or even drinking water. So it's a lot more challenging to recover from or survive a climate disaster or displacement. Hurricane Katrina is one of the most extensively studied disasters to date. The APA reported that 1 in 6 people who were impacted met the diagnosis for PTSD, and suicide or suicidal thoughts more than doubled for displaced people in New Orleans. And then you can go to the opposite side of the world, where reports are already emerging of a mental health crisis coming out of Australia in the wake of the recent bushfires. And just a decade earlier, Australia had suffered through the longest drought since Europeans settled on the continent, which devastated farmers' crops and livelihoods. And studies there were showing that since the disaster, there was a spike in substance abuse, in chronic depression, in domestic violence, and a lot of other mental health conditions. Or if you head to the Arctic, indigenous people are talking about how a warming climate is wiping out their traditional hunting and cultural practices and keeping them from traveling to their ancestral sites because the landscape is melting beneath them. Suicide has gone up there dramatically as well. People say their cultural identity is being devastated along with the landscape. And I think this quote from an Inuit woman really captures that cultural and spiritual erasure. She said, "Inuit are people of the ice. If there is no more sea ice, how can we be people of the ice?" So questions of colonialism and racism are just absolutely central to these issues. And then the final group that's suffering from climate anxiety is just everybody, whether we're aware of it or not. Even if you've never fled from a wildfire or a hurricane or lost your crops to drought, everybody's daily life is changing in 1,000 very subtle ways. We've all lived through these slow-moving changes, like the loss of bees and songbirds in our backyards, dying trees along the road, or fishing trips where you come back with less and less every year. Those summer days where you can't go outside because the wildfire smoke is so bad. You know, all of that can add up to a very deep sense of loss. And this is what philosopher Glenn Albrecht calls solastalgia. And he's playing on the concept of nostalgia, which is a longing for a time or a place that you can't go back to. But solastalgia happens while you're still at home. So it's the trauma and the helplessness of watching your surroundings become unfamiliar. So he defines it as the condition as a homesickness experienced without ever leaving home. So that's a snapshot of some different ways that eco-anxiety and grief are experienced. But before I wrap up by sharing the practical strategies for coping with these difficult emotions, I want to say a few words about how we typically think about grief and how we might reframe it in more empowering ways. So this is the topic that I've been exploring in my new podcast, Facing It, which is available on all the podcast apps out there. You can also find it on my website. In a nutshell, the podcast is looking at how we might use grief as a very valuable resource for us in these times. So I'm going to read a 2-minute excerpt that kind of introduces these ideas. When I first launched my seminar on eco-anxiety, I was every bit as distressed as my students and looking for ways to extinguish my grief for all the suffering. But something unexpected happened along the way. I had always thought of grief as a bad thing, a dark state to avoid or overcome as quickly as possible. I thought that feeling grief was like succumbing to a preventable illness, or that once it took hold, I might fall into a bottomless hole of despair. But it eventually dawned on me that maybe we were seeking solutions to the wrong problem. We all wanted to fix the way we felt so we could go back to feeling happy. But grief isn't something to be fixed because it's not dysfunctional. It's a healthy and necessary process we have to undergo in order to heal. In fact, grief can be a tremendous source of wisdom as we move into an uncertain climate future. I know this may sound controversial in a moment when environmentalists are urging us to focus on hope, but the two are not mutually exclusive. And for many people, grief may be an even more powerful force for transformation. First, grief isn't just one option out of many for accepting loss. Grief is the process of accepting loss. I get why many people working towards sustainability want to sidestep emotional issues and push the public straight into action. The situation is urgent, and dwelling on our feelings can seem like an extravagance as the fires close in. But the problem is when we try to jump straight to the final step without first processing the emotional toll of all this lost beauty and life, we're bypassing the very insights that motivate us to fight for our world in the first place. Ignoring ecological grief is like trying to rush through any great loss, a job, a home, someone you love, without pausing to acknowledge what you're leaving behind. In all of those cases, we're not just losing something we once had, we're also losing the future that many of us had counted on. We can't act creatively and honestly in this new reality if we still believe we're living in the old one. And most of us are stuck in a pre-climate change fantasy realm, clinging to delusions that our world in coming years will still be the world we imagined growing up. Denial isn't just a description for people who reject the science. It describes university professors like me, and scientists who devote their lives to studying climate change, and activists fighting to keep things from getting worse. We understand the problem intellectually, but we don't live as though we do. We accept the facts, but we haven't felt our way through what those facts mean, how our lives, how all lives will be undone in some way. We're like the person who knows a loved one is dead, but hasn't let that reality penetrate to their core, where it will reorganize all the ways they relate to the past and future and determine all they have to let go of. So in the podcast, I'm also trying to push beyond, and I think this is evident from hopefully the passage that I just read, trying to push beyond just reframing grief as something that's not bad, to also consider ways that it is actively good. And there are two reasons that I would make that claim. First is that grief arises from deep attachment and connection. It is a sign of love for our world. You will not grieve for something that you don't love. And grief can also then be a way of affirming our connection and empathy with other species and recognizing that our identities and well-beings are entwined with other lives. So we shouldn't think of grief and love as opposites, but actually they're two sides of the same coin. And I have a quote here from Seattle artist Chris Jordan, who's written that when we try to be cheerful and suppress our grief, we're actually suppressing our love for it. And then the second positive aspect of eco-grief is that it breaks down boundaries we've created between ourselves and other species, as well as other humans. In our culture, there is a hierarchy of lives that matter and lives that don't. So some deaths receive elaborate mourning rituals and public tributes, while others are trivialized and ignored. And marginalized groups know very well how that absence of public grief dehumanizes them, which is exactly why LGBTQ activists, Black Lives Matter, and people seeking justice for murdered Indigenous women use public protests and vigils to demand that those deaths are not made invisible. But when we refuse to shield ourselves from this pain of other species' death, we take part in what's called resistant mourning, which is where we consciously choose to hold on to feelings of grief and pain to spur a sense of responsibility for that loss. So the politics of grief intersect with questions of social justice on multiple levels here. Okay, so keeping all of this context in mind, I want to wrap up with sharing these 4 strategies for managing climate despair and anxiety. Number one, acknowledge it. I think everything I just covered really is a form of acknowledging our distress. If you're like me and you've spent entire nights awake in bed, just imagining the end of the world, hearing yourself say that out loud makes it more manageable. I'm sure many of you have probably heard this saying from neuroscience: if you can name it, you can tame it. And one of the reasons I think this openness is especially important when it comes to anxiety and grief around climate issues is precisely because both the cause and the emotional impact remain so unacknowledged in public life. We barely even have a vocabulary to name this condition. So of course it's going to seem deviant or irrational. And you also hear a lot of climate activists say that they feel intense pressure to always project hope and optimism. Of course, hope-based communication is very important, and I think all of us understand that. But the climate community can really go too far in policing any expression of these darker emotions. And that can backfire when you consider that suppressing feelings of sadness and anger leads to much bigger problems down the road. That's where we start to see chronic anxiety, substance abuse, or rage. And there's extensive research showing how that results from repressing our feelings. Number two is to talk about it. I already mentioned that hearing yourself talk openly about dark feelings is personally therapeutic, but the benefits are also social. One of the ongoing questions in climate work is, why aren't more people taking action and demanding change? Our typical assumption is that the public doesn't care or they don't understand the science. But research actually shows that that is not true. National polling shows that almost 90% of Americans believe that climate change is happening, and 62% identify as being concerned or very worried, according to the most recent surveys out of the Yale program on climate communications. But even though we're carrying around this fear and concern, we live in a culture of climate silence in the United States. People don't talk about it, and that makes it seem less urgent, or just less likely that we ourselves are the ones with the agency and the responsibility. Instead, we assume that scientists or politicians are going to deal with it. And this is extremely dangerous for the very simple reason that we are social creatures. Evidence-based psychology shows that having conversations and social interactions is the driving force for behavior change. Whether you're interacting at the workplace or at school or sports events or on social media, we look around and we take our cues from each other. And when climate change never comes up, it reinforces that socially constructed denial. And then also, a huge part of the depression and anxiety in response to environmental issues comes from feeling alone and isolated. When you feel isolated, you aren't empowered to take action. But talking about emotional responses helps create a sense of community and solidarity. So when I've surveyed my own students, they say over and over again that the single most helpful thing about taking my seminar was being in the room with other people who were talking about the same struggles and being heard when they voiced their own distress. So the takeaway here is that we just have to get rid of this very misleading binary about talk versus action, right? Talk is action. Number three, get outside or make time for self-care. Even if you've never read the actual research, I bet many of you have at least seen the headlines of these studies confirming that time spent outside enhances mental health and well-being. People who've remained successful in environmental activism over the long term draw strength from their relation to nature. But most activists are really, really bad at giving themselves breaks, right? We feel like we have to attend every meeting or volunteer event or every protest, and then we feel guilty when we don't show up. But self-care is exactly the kind of work that enables us to be social change agents and helps us avoid burnout so that we can stay engaged in, over the long haul. We have to remember that the climate battle is a marathon rather than a sprint. But then I also think most importantly, being in nature reminds us why it's worth fighting for climate solutions in the first place. The world is still a beautiful place, and there's still so much left to protect. And then my final step, number 4, is to take action. Action is the best antidote to grief. There is nothing more therapeutic. It's action that gives rise to hope and not the other way around. This always gives rise to the question, okay, so what type of action is going to be the most effective? It's the most common question that I'm asked, right? What's the best thing that I can do? There really is no single response to that, which I think feels both overwhelming and liberating. One thing that makes the climate crisis unique is that it is a truly all-encompassing threat. What's happening up in the atmosphere is only a symptom of something that's much, much more complex happening down below. It's not just CO2 emissions, but it's our economy and our consumer way of life, social justice and inequality, agriculture and food. It's about the books that we read our children, the way that we design buildings and cities. Sarah Jaquette Ray has said, and this is the quote on the bottom of this slide, in the climate battle, the front lines are everywhere. So that's both a challenge and an opportunity, because it means that there are endless ways that you can engage, right? You don't have to wait for a protest in the streets. My own background is in the humanities. I'm not a science, I'm not an expert in climate policy at all, but I don't have to be, and you don't have to be either. Every person alive will be impacted and is a protagonist in this story. So all of us can contribute by using whatever tools we have. I think the best approach to determining how to engage is to prioritize these 2 things. First, identify what you're good at so that you'll be effective, but also identify what aligns with your own passion and interests so that you don't lose motivation. So that could mean doing something through the arts or social media, making changes in your workplace or at school. It could be working with kids or older folks. I've even mentored video game designers who are developing games with climate themes. People can work in the realms of law or public health. There's really no part of our lives that is not part of the climate story. And I do want to be clear as I wrap up that the point is not that, just 12 people going out and doing a wetland restoration project in our area is going to solve climate change. But what really matters here is getting engaged exercises our civic muscles. And that is so important at a moment when we desperately need collective action. For way too long, we have been fixated on individual consumer responsibility and market solutions. So buying eco-friendly cars or switching to an electric or products, using your Canvas shopping bag. Those are all important, but we just don't have the 50 years that it would take to solve this by incremental personal changes. Climate change is a systemic threat. Oops, I think I got ahead of myself. That requires organization at every level. So communities, states, and international agreements to coordinate between them. And there's just no comparison in the relative impact between structural changes and individual lifestyle changes. So this is what we mean when we refer to politics as a moral multiplier. So politically it makes sense, but it also makes sense psychologically. And this is my final point. Getting engaged in climate solutions helps build solidarity. I already mentioned that the sense of isolation that people feel leads to hopelessness and depression in the face of this threat. So cognitive psychologists really emphasize how important it is for us to imagine ourselves as part of a team. And this also counteracts the very pervasive concern that our actions are just too insignificant to matter, right? And we think, why even bother? My students hit this wall all the time. They feel completely helpless because their impact seems so small compared to the scale of this crisis. But if we see ourselves as working collectively rather than individually, we can recognize that all of those contributions are syncing up with a much larger network of change. This is what Adrienne Marie Brown calls emergent strategy. So it's a movement that spirals out from all kinds of small local actions and creates a much more complex system. Economist Donatella Meadows also talks about this when she makes the point that we need to think in terms of leverage points, where a small shift in one thing can produce big changes in everything. And there's an example from Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in the Dark, that I love. I think it illustrates this so well. In the 1960s, the Women's Strike for Peace was the first organized anti-nuclear movement in the US. And when they were interviewed, activists or participants said that they felt that their efforts achieved nothing at the time. But in fact, they ultimately contributed to major victories like the ban on above ground nuclear testing, which was creating the radioactive fallout showing up in babies' teeth and mother's milk. And this slide shows an excerpt from an interview with one of those activists. So Solnit wrote here, "The woman from WSP told of how foolish and futile she had felt standing in the rain one morning protesting at the Kennedy White House. Years later, she heard Dr. Benjamin Spock, who had become one of the most high-profile activists on the issue, said that the turning point for him was spotting a small group of women standing in the rain protesting at the White House. If they were so passionately committed, he thought, he should give the issue more consideration himself." So this is a reminder that social change is hard to measure. So, the next time you see Greta Thunberg giving some big speech before the UN, it's really important to remember that she is just a single point, a visible point that is resulting from the invisible work of thousands of unnamed people behind the scenes. Scientists, activists, the journalists who brought attention to this climate story, the teachers who ignited her awareness, could have been some anonymous passerby that said an encouraging word to keep her going through that first winter of striking alone. And then, of course, all of the youth climate strikers who are spreading and amplifying this message and having impacts of their own, which are impossible to trace and may not even be visible until years down the road. I think that should be reason for hope rather than discouragement, because it means that every time you have a conversation or share a book or inspire somebody by example, those actions may get multiplied by a much larger community that you may never even meet. And so I'll close with this quote from Margaret Mead, which I've always loved. She said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." And that's what I've got. And I'm happy to take questions from participants. Let's see, I might need to stop share here.
Thank you, Dr. Jennifer, for an excellent presentation about climate change. So we will now start taking questions. So if you guys have any questions, you guys can use the chat box to ask your question, and also you guys can use the reaction sticker. So then we will unmute you so that you can ask the question to the speaker directly. Let me see. I see you have like a few questions here. So it's from Kathy. She asks, NBC News say carbon emission drop 17% global amid coronavirus. So how can we leverage this to keep change in the carbon emission going in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, you're seeing so many of these headlines right now about these positive environmental impacts of the slowdown in our economy. And it's tricky because we don't want to celebrate the way that this has happened at all, right? This is causing so much immense suffering to people who have lost their jobs and people who are losing their lives. This is not the way to address climate change, right? First of all, it's not a lasting solution, right? We could just go back to the old ways of life in another month, and all of those benefits will be wiped out, right? And we don't want it to happen through catastrophe and pandemic. We want to have it happen through, democratic change and through people voting and pushing for these changes and getting the fossil fuel obstructionism out of the way, so that what people actually want, and the majority of people overwhelmingly on both sides of the political spectrum, want a shift to renewable energy. So I think what really is most important about the dramatic changes that we're seeing right now, right? The health impacts of people not being exposed to particulate matter, particularly poor people and people of color who live next to coal-fired plants and refineries. those are also, I think it's also really interesting to see how much more susceptible they are to COVID because of the compromises to their respiratory system, because they had already, been exposed to such bad air quality. So we're seeing like all of these really interesting intersections between the public health crisis and the climate crisis. I think that is a really, really powerful connection, because for a long time, people have seen climate change as something that's abstract, something that's just happening to polar bears, something that's just happening, in far off places, and not something that's happening to us in the present to our bodies. And it is a physical health crisis. So that's one connection that's really important. But then really to get back to the substance of your question, I think what this moment, the pandemic, has proved is that all of the arguments that our political leaders and businesses have been using for all of these years, that we can't make these changes, that we can't transition quickly enough, it is a complete lie, because we just did it, right? When we make it a priority, we can make changes very, very quickly. So I think this is going to be the big question going into the next election, and then all of the work that has to be done after that to hold our leaders accountable to say, not only do we want to make this transition, and that we can make this transition, but that it has to be a just transition, right? So that those who have been suffering the disproportional burdens of the health effects and the economic effects of this very destructive fossil fuel economy need to be first in line from receiving the benefits and having those jobs and having the kinds of health benefits that will come with that transition. So it's really, what your question is, I could answer it in so many different ways. It's really complicated and really interesting. And I think everywhere that you look for those connections between the climate crisis and the pandemic, you see those links. And I think it's fascinating. And we need to keep that conversation going, because that's going to be a really powerful motivator in keeping this energy moving towards making that transition.
Thank you for answering. So we have our next question from Laura. She said recently we seem to be hearing more and more about eco anxiety. So do you know why?
Yeah, it's like I've been working on this for years, and I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. Like, I feel like there's like 10 different theories that are all, really convincing. And I think that there's probably some truth in all of them. One, I think it is a question of awareness. I think that a lot of that anxiety really is coming from younger people who are much more aware of climate impacts than their parents' generation. But also, I think one of the big things is the question or the conversation around climate change used to be about predictions, right? So these are risks that are going to happen out in the future. And now we're actually seeing consequences. Like, we are living it. Those fires are burning outside of our homes and filling the air in the cities where we live. Those hurricanes are devastating people that we know. It's hard to find anybody who doesn't know somebody who has been impacted by climate chaos. And so I think that that's made this problem much more real and immediate. And I also think that the other reason that anxiety has increased so dramatically and so quickly is because the way scientists are talking about this issue has really, really changed just in the last 3 to 5 years. Scientists are trained to be very, very measured and cautious in the way that they communicate these issues. So the language just has never really carried that much punch. And then when the IPCC came out with its, ringing the alarm on climate change, I think now I can't remember if it was 2017 or 2018, they really were talking about this as a game changer for the planet and the ability for human civilization to survive the kinds of changes. I mean, it really, using the words of crisis in such explicit ways, I think that has gotten people's attention. And I think that climate scientists themselves are being more vocal about the anxiety and despair that they feel, that they were burying that and suppressing that for so long, and they feel more empowered to be open about that. I think actually, to be honest, there are a lot more women in the sciences now who use that language and are more explicit about the emotional and psychological impact and toll. And so I think that's opened a space for people to talk about something that really has been there actually for a long time. We just haven't had the language to talk about it or a space where it's safe to do so. And I think that's one of the things that has changed. So it's a lot of different answers to that question, but I think a combination of all of them is really where the truth lies.
Um, Thank you. So there's another question from Angela. She asks, what can we do to help? And the world has been changing for generation. What do we do?
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? And that's the one to go back to. I say that's the most common question that I'm asked, and it's really hard for me to give a single answer to that question, because there are just everything needs to change, right? So I think it's really important to not put the burden on yourself to think that you have to like become a climate scientist or you have to get a particular politician elected, and if that goal isn't achieved, that all is lost. Because when we put that kind of pressure on ourselves, it seems so overwhelming that there's nothing that an individual can do that's going to be significant enough to move the needle. But again, if you think of yourself as part of a groundswell movement, what you can do is, I mean, there are infinite answers to that question. So, again, I would think about what is it that motivates you as an individual and interests you? Is it working with children? Are you interested in our oceans? Are you interested in our forests? Are you interested in food security in the city, right? Community gardens and greening areas of our cities where people don't have access to green space, right? Those are social justice questions. And see if you can find a way to get involved in those efforts, because the likelihood that you're going to stay engaged and that you're going to stay committed is much higher if you're doing something that already lines up with your interests. So I think that, that's really the answer. It's not like a single thing is going to happen. Like, history is so complex and social change is so complex. 2 years ago, there's just no way that we could have imagined that, a 15-year-old girl striking outside of Parliament was going to help kick off this huge global climate strike. And I'm not giving her specifically, Greta, I'm not giving her credit for it. That energy was already there. It just needed a catalyst, right? And anything can be a catalyst. But if you're already there sort of waiting and working towards it, then once that fire gets lit, the fuel is everywhere, ready to, I shouldn't use probably fire as an analogy. I know it's problematic when we're talking about climate change, but so the answer to your question really is find an organization, or you can go online and there's so much great work that's happening in our community. There's this stuff around the arts and using music to build awareness around this, and a lot of things that are really fun and creative. And if you're not already working in an environmental space or a scientific space, that doesn't matter. There are so many different ways to get engaged. So browse around and see what ignites your passion.
Thank you. So another question from Cindy. Is it not only the carbon emission, but also the loss of rainforest and open grass area? And would thinking about product we buy, such as product with palm oils, also give us a way into how we can help restore the forest and wildlife habitat that being devastated?
Yeah, and I didn't quite hear all of the second part of the question, but
okay. I can repeat again. Sorry. Is it not only the carbon emission, but also the loss of rainforest and open green areas? And would thinking about the product we buy, such as product with palm oils, will also give us a voice into how we can help restore the forest and wildlife habitat that are being devastated?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the research that's coming out about the way that we use our land is, and again, it goes back to the point that like climate change isn't something that's just happening up in the atmosphere. It's something that's happening in the soil, in the oceans, in our trees, in our grasslands, in our wetlands. So I think that yeah, consumer changes are important to be aware. I mean, I think that, I actually heard a scientist talking who I respect very much about 2 years ago. And she got the question that I got, the last question, which what's the most important thing we can do? And she said, other than being politically engaged and demanding for political action, as a consumer, the two most important things that you can do were to reduce your consumption of meat and to eliminate your consumption of palm kernel oil, which is in so many products. And it is mind-boggling how much it is driving deforestation. And deforestation is more than just about climate change, right? It's loss of biodiversity, loss of livelihoods and habitat for indigenous people who have been living in those places for thousands of years. So human rights issues. And the whole processed food industry is based on palm kernel oil. It's in everything, and it's absolutely devastating. So I think that not supporting that by buying those products is really important, but we have to go beyond that, right? Because if 5% of people say we're not going to buy these products anymore, we're going to cut back on eating animal protein, that's also driving deforestation. A lot of the fires in the Amazon really came back to like our Western consumption patterns around meat and the way that is encroaching on tropical areas. But it really also has to be about, I actually think that politically supporting indigenous rights is one of the most powerful ways to protect rainforests and to protect forests around the world. If you look at any continent, the original inhabitants of those forests are indigenous people, and they are still there. Their numbers have obviously been incredibly diminished because of this history of genocide and colonialism, but they're still there fighting for the protection of those spaces. So there have been some really fascinating studies showing that supporting indigenous rights and returning the rights of regulation for those lands to the tribes would be one of the biggest wins for climate change and conservation, because those people want to be able to preserve their indigenous ways of life, and they can't preserve those lives if the forests are destroyed. So they have their own personal investment, and they have their own cultural knowledge and history in how people can live in those spaces in ways that are not destructive to them. So, and that's another question that has a lot of answers to it, and it's really complex and has political dimensions and consumer dimensions and human rights issues or human rights dimensions. But all of those working together are really important in preserving our forests.
Thank you. So now our time is running out. We will take two more questions that's already in the chat box. So the first question from Sarah. She asked, how did you become a speaker and what inspired you to do what you do?
That's a great question. I had the hugest phobia of public speaking of anybody I know when I was a graduate student. If I had to speak, even when I started teaching, I would have anxiety attacks the night before, and I would try to memorize everything I was going to say because I figured, I'm not going to be able to get through this. And I think, one of the things that helped is recognizing that you don't have to be good at everything. You can do the work of critical thinking and putting together ideas, and maybe you're not necessarily that good at presenting them. So, use your notes. Who cares if you have to use a crutch? I mean, when we look at professional athletes, we don't say that one basketball player is better than the other because one of them wears a knee brace. If you have to use a crutch, use a crutch. And that's one of the things I do. I always use my notes when I'm speaking. And I think it empowered me to realize, you don't have to be able to be sort of naturally eloquent and be an accomplished stage actor to get into public speaking. The way that I got into it more immediately is I was already teaching at University of Washington, and I saw so many of my students falling into despair. I thought, this is a real crisis because we're going to lose the next generation of climate justice leaders if people retreat into despair. And so I wanted to provide some sort of resources, and I started offering this seminar on steps for managing eco grief and climate anxiety. And honestly, I wasn't an expert in it at all. I learned just as much from my students. And we kind of looked at what was out there, what kinds of research. We looked into psychology, we looked into social movement literature, and kind of learned along the way over the last few years. And then when the news started getting interested in the fact that this class was being offered, I started getting asked a lot more to do public speaking. And I think it's important. I want to be able to share the kinds of things that we've learned with our students, with the rest of the public. So yeah, it was basically just saying yes when I was asked, and that kind of opened a pathway for doing this on a more national scale.
Thank you. The last question from Samantha. So do you feel this pandemic will light a fire under those that have been thinking of getting involved in climate/environmental field? So one thing become normal, do you think there would be more people acting on their eco-anxiety, especially with younger generation?
I do, because I think one lesson that we have learned from this pandemic that is not going to go away is that if you don't take action early, the consequences are going to be so much more painful down the road, very quickly down the road, right? So that momentum to act before the problem becomes a crisis is, something, again, like, how soon a community responds and takes the kinds of health measures to protect its community. You don't really know what the effects are going to be. There's like a 2-week delay time, right? And then you start seeing all the contagion and infection and death rates from decisions that were made 2 weeks earlier. Well, climate change is just an amplified example of that, right? The lag time between what we do now and what we end up suffering from 2 years or 10 years down the road makes it a little bit harder. But I think this is like a microcosm example of why we need to act early and aggressively, right? Because we will be paying those prices. I mean, right now we're already suffering the consequences of carbon that was burned 20 years earlier. It just makes that a lot more visible. But I think it's also going to give, this is like maybe a good closing point to all of this, I think it also gives young people a much more powerful platform to demand change from the older generation and people who are in power. Because overwhelmingly, COVID is affecting older people, right? There are some cases of younger people getting ill, but overwhelmingly, the most severe penalties are being felt by older generations, by the baby boomers. And young people are saying, look, we're giving up our graduation. We're giving up all of our fun. We're giving up our social lives. We are making these sacrifices to protect you. When this is over, we want you to make some sacrifices to protect us, because if you want to live to see next year, yes, we will make those sacrifices now, but we want to live to see the next century. And so our leaders need to take that seriously as well, so that there is not so much intergenerational injustice and inequity in the responses to these two issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jennifer Atkinson, for having an excellent presentation and answering all of our participant questions. So the time is running out, and so thank you everyone for joining the Triton Talk. And so just a reminder, this recording will be posted on our school website. So yeah, I hope everyone have a good day. And again, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you all for joining.
And I'll end this meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Actually, I have one more question. Do you are you able to share your contact list to our participants so that they can contact you directly?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I can give you my email. Also, if you go to my website, which was on the slides, you can contact me directly through my website. And then all the other resources like the podcast are there, as well as additional readings and videos. But yes, you're welcome to send me emails if you want updates. And again, for other talks that I'm going to be giving, which kind of go all across the spectrum of this issue, on Instagram and Facebook, I tend to post those pretty regularly, so you can always look for new events there. Yeah, so feel free to reach out.
Okay. Thank you, and I'll end this meeting.
Thank you.
Bye.